we can all think back to the hard injuries we have had over the years. I think back to some of the ones that I've had, and if I could go back and give myself one piece of advice, it would probably be try and target specific muscles and be more clear on the muscle or even the region within the muscle that we're trying to target.
All right. Fearghal, welcome to VALDCAST.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, Fearghal, obviously in the last, 4 or 5 years, your name has continuously been synonymous with best practice in hamstrings and all these sorts of things. So I'd be hard pressed to find people that aren't familiar with you that are listening. But in case there are, would you mind just giving the listeners a brief background in who you are and what you do today?
Yeah, cool. So look, I guess most of my early career, I worked in professional rugby here in Ireland. So I worked with Leinster Rugby for 9 years. And during that time, I was really lucky the club supported me in carrying out a PhD on hamstring injuries. It was probably at a time where we were starting to recognise that maybe despite rehab often being pretty good, where we were going wrong was often around structural diagnosis. We were starting to integrate things like the BAMIC and intramuscular tendon and T-junction injury and the considerations that might have for rehabilitation within our practice. So I suppose I picked up the ball and ran with that a little bit. And off the back of that, I just grew my network out and people wanted to have conversations because I think we probably took an interest in that maybe 12 or 18 months before the kind of the community at large. And it allowed me to start building connections and learn a lot about best practice internationally. And yeah, I guess from there, really lucky I got a unique role at Chelsea Football Club in the Premier League, where my job title was physiotherapist and then in brackets hamstring injury prevention. And yeah, so I guess that was a real opportunity to go to depth on an injury where I was primarily dealing with one type of injury at a Premier League club, and so I put my thoughts and my focus on that for a couple of years while over there. And yeah, I suppose I made the decision then after a couple of years there to move back to Ireland, set up my HQ here. And what I'm probably in a unique situation now at the moment is just the volume of hamstring injuries that I see. You know, I probably see, somewhere between 25 and 30 a week, every week. And yeah, I suppose what I recognise now on hamstring injuries, I wouldn't have recognised a year ago. There's all kinds of weird and wonderful hamstring injuries, but I probably have seen most of them now at this stage, I think. But yeah, within that, it gives me an opportunity to test and check and challenge my practice a lot more than I would have done when I was in a team environment, where at times you might be working with one hamstring injury at a time, or a couple at most. Whereas now, you start to pick up on trends, and I suppose pattern recognition is probably the big thing that I have the opportunity to do now at the moment. So I guess that's my Dublin role. And then I suppose I'm in a situation then where I travel quite a bit. I support teams really internationally, and I get to travel quite a bit and experience that. And I suppose again, the benefit of that, it's more for me than for anybody else. I just get to learn what's the evolving best practice in professional sport at the moment, and try and say, well, actually, what are the elements of that I can take and put into my own practice once I go home. So yeah, I've quite a good balance at the moment.
Fearghal, with the fact that you're seeing like this high volume of very niche populations of hamstring injuries, obviously, if this is kind of day in and day out, it's some people would assume, this is a lot of bread and butter stuff of just kind of like go through the routine. But from your perspective, what in the last maybe 6 to 8 weeks are you learning? Like, what's new with you when it comes to treating and training these sorts of injuries?
Yeah, I guess probably the big one that I'm seeing at the moment that's a bit of a theme and a bit of an interest for me is a lot of athletes who have legacy deficits after having hamstring graft harvest for an ACL repair. So generally what tends to be the pattern on those guys is they will have their ACL, they'll return to play in 8 to 12 months, and then things will go very, very well for a couple of years. And then generally I'm seeing with a theme of guys who will then probably in the third season back feel something minor, more medially, and that seems to possibly be an injury around the graft site where maybe it had attached to an adjacent muscle or whatever it may be, and then they go on to start picking up recurrent hamstring injuries, be they medial, distal, or just traditional biceps injuries. But seeing quite a few of those now. Again, I'm not entirely sure what's the root cause of this. Is there things that we could be doing earlier in the ACL rehabilitation? Is it an element of we're rehabbing all our ACLs like patellar tendons, or is there something we could be doing better in terms of the longer term management of those guys. But certainly that's a really common theme that I see, where they start running into trouble a few years down the track. And I suppose within those guys, there's, again, you talk about pattern recognition, but you'll pick out the same 4 or 5 kind of key things with those guys, really around that kind of mid and inner range dysfunction. And, you test them on the NOR board in particular, and it's almost, it's almost impossible at that point. You'll find they have that huge 30% mid-range deficit. Really interestingly, they'll often have decent peaks, but they really struggle to get going on the Nordic. And I think at that point, it can be quite challenging. Like, I have one guy at the moment, just returned, but he had gone an ACL injury as a late teen, had a medial hamstring harvest, then had a high-grade semi-mem, which he had repaired, and then ultimately coming back from that, we kind of only got him back to about 80% symmetry for strength, but on return had a high-grade T-junction, and it's been quite a challenging return to play. We've finally got him back in now, but effectively he's had some fairly significant damage to all 3 hamstrings. But I think if we trace back the original sin, so to speak, or the original challenge, I think it goes back to, well, actually, there might have been a bit left behind on his original medial hamstring injury or medial hamstring graft. So I think there's more and more we can probably look to do around that. Now, again, we talk about my volume and about the weird, wonderful things I see. Maybe that's just a fluke that I'm seeing quite a few of them, or maybe it's my filter that they kind of tend to injure and re-injure, and because I see a volume of hamstrings, they ultimately turn up at my door. But it definitely is, I'm picking up a couple of these a week, to be honest, at the moment. And it's pretty hard as an elite sprinter, for instance, when you've gone through that process, and then you might go on to find it quite difficult on the bend in kind of the longer sprints. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. And again, I would say, not, if you had asked me 12 to 15 months ago, before I had the benefit of volume, I mightn't be able to kind of say, okay, this is a recurring theme, so to speak, that I see. But now, yeah, definitely that's one of the things that's forefront in my mind at the moment, and kind of trying to work on some processes around that with kind of some of the radiologists, sports medicine guys that I collaborate pretty closely with.
In that case, you mentioned the fact that virtually each hamstring muscle kind of was affected in its own way, whether it's an initial injury or subsequent insults. It kind of gets me thinking, like, what are the ways, or maybe I should just say, are there ways that we can kind of bias specific muscles within the hamstring muscle group as a whole, to, in theory, improve the capacity within specific regions of the hamstrings? If you get injured in a certain region, kind of makes sense that you'd want that region to then, get a little bit stronger, or at least just have more tolerance to load. How can we, or what ways can we kind of bias certain muscle groups or muscles within the muscle group?
Yeah. So again, that's a real passion of mine. Again, when I think about the things that some of the more challenging injuries, and, we can all think back to the hard injuries we have had over the years. I think back to some of the ones that I've had, and if I could go back and give myself one piece of advice, it would probably be try and target specific muscles and be more clear on the muscle or even the region within the muscle that we're trying to target. So yeah, I think it's probably one of the most common things that I see that I want to do. So yeah, I think, look, if we go with a carpet bomb approach to strength training, we'll generally get them all strong, because, making guys stronger, particularly the young male athletes, not that hard. So to improve somebody's numbers can be reasonably easy. But I mean, we've all done it where we've made somebody strong, symmetrical on a number of tests, and they've immediately go on to re-injure. So it has to be more than just achieving that. Now, of course, that's kind of base camp, is to get somebody strong and symmetrical. But then within that, well, what if I've had a biceps injury, and how I'm creating force now is just by becoming bigger and stronger and more efficient to the medial hamstring or short head or whatever it may be. So yeah, I think we need a strategy around that. So I think it just comes back to a little bit of it is around thinking about the function of the muscles. So yeah, generally, I suppose, look, for me, it's frequently biceps that we're trying to target, or biceps long head. And what's, to me, separates biceps from the rest of the hamstring muscles is it's an external rotator of the hip. So generally, I'll try and put some degree of hip external rotation or resisted external rotation into the exercise. Similarly for the medial hamstring, then for our kind of distal or short head injuries, they're knee flexors, so be kind of a knee flexor component, semitendinosis, which seems to be most efficient towards mid to inner range. Again, that kind of fits with what we see with those post ACL harvests. So I suppose each of them has 2 or 3 distinct things around it that are helpful. But I would also say I'm so far from dogmatic in terms of actually, this is how an exercise has to be, or this is my biceps exercise. Of course, I have my biceps exercises, but I have no problem if I set up a biceps exercise and he says, or she says, actually, this works better if I, let my hip drop this way, or if I put the band on differently, or if my bias is to go very light on an exercise and it works better, heavier, then absolutely no problem whatsoever. Or I had one just today where ultimately I think we were sabotaged a little bit by the fact that his back coming into play on most of his hinge work, which would obviously be a fantastic proximal biceps exercise if we could do it. But for him, it's just not a runner as an exercise. So we have to go elsewhere. And I think, I suppose we carry that on. How can we be clear other than just picking an exercise? I suppose EMG is popular and it's something that I'm completely open to using in my practice, but I've not found one that works well for me yet. It's something that maybe in 2026 I'm going to explore further and further and demo things. But to be honest, for me so far, it's been a little bit messy and I've found things that have contradicted what seems logical. So it may be a contradiction or it may be crosstalk in the data that I'm collecting. So yeah, how do we know? Look, to be honest, for me, an awful lot of it comes down to dialogue and kind of putting my finger on where they're meant to be feeling the work. And I'll come back to, well, actually, what are you feeling doing that exercise? And if they say, yeah, it's really hard, I feel that in my back, then, I mean, ultimately, it's not a runner. One guy said, do you ever get back pain? He said, yeah, only when I'm doing my hamstring exercises though. I was like, right, brilliant. Okay, that's super. Because I mean, that ultimately solves 2 problems. So yeah, he or she doesn't say that they're feeling it in the area that we're trying to target on that particular exercise. Then I can't be convinced that it's going to do what it says on the tin. And, I've certainly given some athletes, subsequent hamstring injuries by overusing some of the other muscles, by just throwing strength at them, or I've given guys kind of overused tendinopathies and pes ansternesis and things like that over the years, which I think actually, better coaching, better dialogue, better clarity on the exercise, and just staying awake as I kind of coach the exercise and kind of keeping that open with them set on set, I think makes a monster of a difference. So yeah, certain exercises, certain key things about muscles can help us to optimally train that muscle, set it up for victory. But I don't think anything supersedes actually dialogue and chatting to them about what they feel as they go through the process.
Mm-hmm. And let's say you've been, working with these athletes, and, it's a couple of weeks have gone by and you're looking to kind of reassess and see what has changed from whether it's a capacity standpoint, whether it's a pain standpoint. What tests do you tend to kind of go towards? And you mentioned Nordics before, but are there any specifics in terms of positions, changes to typical testing regimes that you normally kind of look at that you've found to be a little bit more helpful in your practice?
Yeah, well, there's definitely themes that I pick up. So even if we just think remote to the hamstring for a second, there's definitely themes that will tend to pick up time and time again, specific to particular types of hamstring injuries. Like I don't think I've ever seen a T-junction injury that was as strong as I would want them to be into abduction. I don't think I've ever seen a biceps femoris injury that was as strong as I want them to be in hip extension. So there's definitely different themes that I would pick up elsewhere that would form, it'll be absolutely central to it. And I'm kind of very conscious of, I suppose, a lot of the time what I see is somebody who's had a couple of injuries. So, really, it probably is honestly 1 in 25. I'd say one a week where I would say, oh, this guy actually just has a decent asymmetry, or this guy isn't what I would categorize as strong in terms of the hamstring itself. But yeah, look, I guess broadly speaking, then when I would take them, I can carry out a physiotherapist, I'll carry out my bed-based assessment first, and I would have expectations for what I would want to see, I suppose, based ultimately on what's my narrative. I'll set up a narrative every time somebody comes in as to why are we in this situation, and that will be based entirely on, firstly, what's my anatomical diagnosis, i.e., what do we think we're dealing with here from an MRI structural standpoint. And I think that's clearly critical, because if we don't have that, then we're playing with one hand tied behind our back, or we're making assumptions, or we can deliver an exceptional product, but ultimately we get suffocated by the fact that anatomy or pathology is not in our favor. One, obviously establish that, or whether we think, might be a radicular cause or something else pathological that's influencing it. And I'll set that up initially, and that would help my expectations and so on. Then, of course, I suppose to your question in a long-winded way, what's my functional diagnosis? So what are the elements that I think are loading or overloading that hamstring injury? So I'll set 2 to 3 goals specifically around the hamstring itself, and I'll set 2 to 3 goals then around other areas, be that based around my assessment of them, or be that based around their previous injury history. Practically then, I guess ultimately, it just, the old answer, but it just depends. Like, so if I'm picking apart somebody, and so frequently to me, they come in and I had a syndesmosis, or I broke my leg 18 months ago when it started there. I had one guy not so long ago, and he had a severe back pain episode 3 years ago, didn't get any hamstring injuries off that, but then broke his leg 18 months later, and the hamstring injury started after that. The focus had all been around his back, but actually if you track the history, they started with the leg injury. So for him, inevitably what we would look to do there would be, okay, let's get a full profile of that lower limb. I would test the hypothesis that that's the problem. So you would then go through, like for me, I'm quite lucky here in my setup in Dublin. I have everything I need, and I have the full kind of black box ISO rack for testing here. So for him, he would be, if we take that kind of example there, knee ISO push, ankle ISO push, he would have Soleus testing on the force frame, and then we'd obviously go through an entire battery of jump markers there. And we're trying to, there's lots of people out there who will be much better at telling you normatives and expectations, and so many people out there are better at rehab and ankles than I am. But really, I suppose for me, the question is, can we start to find things that fit the narrative and the story that we're telling ourselves here, and we just find something and then we address that. And the expectation should be, if we cross off all the things on his problem list related to, I suppose, why the hamstring load might be amplified, then we can reduce the hamstring load. So even if he has been through the wars with a couple of bigger hamstring injuries, well, we might be able to reduce what he's asking of himself from a horizontal force and projection perspective by improving his vertical propulsion capabilities, or so on. So really just trying to fit those back into my story. And then I guess around the hamstring, there's probably is it 1, 2, 3, 4 tests that I'll tend to do with everybody in a perfect world from a hamstring point of view. And again, I would always say to people, these are just the 4 that I do. I think I have a reasonable rationale for all of them, but that's not to say, lots of people do other ones. And again, for me, this is just what fits my setting here and allows me to go through these in a timely manner. But yeah, so I suppose for everybody who comes in here, I'll do an isometric in 2 positions. Isometric on the Nord board as a straight leg prone curl, and I'll do an isometric on the force frame at about 15 degrees knee flexion. I think that allows me to get isometric testing in 2 positions. And I think they're probably 2 distinct qualities. I see plenty of people who are good on one and poor on the other, and the inverse equally being true. And that will influence my exercise selection then, in terms of where in the range I'm trying to load, and some of the exercises that I know are better for one over the other, and how I might go after that. I will use Nordic testing. I don't necessarily do lots and lots of Nordics in rehab, or at least I wouldn't for a recurrent biceps femoris typically, but I will always test everybody on the Nord board for the simple reason that it's really is an exceptional test of their eccentric force tolerance capabilities. And also I think what the Nordic really allows me to do, I want my athletes all, 400, 450s, whatever it may go on to be, but I'm more interested in actually, do they have a nice curve, and can I track that? And does that tell me something interesting about how they create force or how they tolerate force? And then I pick something that will try to influence that, and then that gives me somewhere to go after. So again, most people I see will kind of be marked up as in the higher percentiles, but most people I see will have something interesting going on within that. And I've kind of shared online, and then some of the kind of the VALD practitioner's guide, some really nice examples of ones where you could never say it was a symmetrical curve, but that he comes out as a 6% asymmetry. And I mean, to me, that's gold. So it just shows us, like, don't tell yourself that this guy's symmetrical when actually, you look at the curve, you just don't see that. So I will test, those are 3. And then the other one that I will test is I'll take them into prone 90. So hip extension and 90 degrees knee flexion on the force frame as well. And I'll test them at kind of my kind of almost inner to mid range. So hip extension and knee flexion position as well. The numbers can be quite low on that, maybe 150, 180 newtons a lot of the time, but I'm really just interested in that big inner to mid range deficit that correlates quite nicely with those ones that don't get going on the Nordic, that correlates quite nicely with the ones with the ACL history, and seems to tie you maybe a little bit with some of the groin pain guys that I see as well. So yeah, for me, I will do those 4 with everybody. We'll obviously look to expand that. I have a strength and conditioning coach, Sammy, working with me at the moment, and we're looking to expand what we do, because obviously if I have time with somebody, it can't just be a testing session. So I've got to be clear on, okay, well, to me, that almost allows me to say I'm almost hip dominant with that kind of prone curl on the Nord board, almost my kind of my eccentric knee dominant one with my Nordic, and then testing my knee flexors in a couple of positions. That to me is enough. Now I know other guys will use the likes of the hip ISO push, and Chris Brahma, somebody I kind of enjoy listening to a lot. Chris has other variations in terms of even like a standing version on the force decks. It's something that I'll probably completely open to adding anything into my practice. I just need to see it, recognize it as being worth adding, because ultimately time is so valuable within these that we have to have tests that allow us to test as many competencies as we can that'll influence our programming, and then will give us confidence that they're ready for return to play. So yeah, I guess ultimately those would be my absolute guaranteed. Those hamstring tests will be in every person that comes through here at some stage of the process. And then I'll match around at whatever they need. You know, some people will end up with a max calf raise test, you know, like it just depends on what ultimately is needed for them.
Definitely. I think most listeners can appreciate the fact that you'll start with kind of a basic assessment, and then based on the results from there, you'll obviously want to, you know, dive in deeper on certain areas over others depending on the patient presentation. But the Nord board, it's super interesting, and doing Nordics on there. I think you, as well as, you know, others probably from a little bit previous, like Brian Heiderscheid, have talked about, like, similar to how people will always talk about looking at the force time curve from a counter movement jump or from a drop jump or those sorts of things, like looking at, you know, the waveforms that people are producing from a Nordic is incredibly important. And it's something that I've always wanted to try and like piecemeal together or figure out how to calculate this. Obviously, Nordboard creates like impulse measures and these sorts of things, but trying to figure out if you could separate things similar to like a P1 and P2 from a counter movement jump or from a squat jump, but do like a phase 1 and phase 2 within a Nordic and measure impulse between the two, just to see if there's like early phase versus later phase. I've always just found those sorts of characteristics very interesting.
Yeah, no, it's look, I can tell you with absolute certainty that there's value in it. I can tell you with absolute certainty there's value in it, and I see it every single day in here. Like I think the goal lives in that curve rather than an absolute peak, because we can all achieve high peaks by manipulating, moving the hooks a little bit further up the sock, by kind of by diving into it and trying to hold on late. So there's loads of ways of fooling a peak, and I think, you know, like I've probably never done a consult for a club where one of the comments hasn't been, this guy is our strongest on the Nord board, but actually the value is in fitting that within the bigger picture, be that in either the technical side of how they do the Nordic, what that looks like from a wave perspective. And because like, I mean, ultimately I have guys who come in here, I tend not to cue them as they do it, because I tend to I like to watch what they do for the first couple of reps. And some guys will, you know, do your 8-second hold on it, and ultimately their peak won't be huge, but their kind of newtons per second will be huge. Newtons multiplied by seconds will be huge in terms of overall work done. So there's lots within that, and I think reducing and simplifying that exercise to just a peak. And it's definitely something that, you know, particularly when I worked in sport and you're trying to run through a team on it, just not maybe taking the time to look at that and kind of just focusing on one outcome. Whereas I think ultimately we should be looking at can we tick this off for symmetry? Yes or no? Can we tick it for peak? Yes or no? And can we tick it off for curve quality, or whatever terminology you experts would have on that? Then absolutely. And I've some cool examples this year. Ultimately, as I always say to everybody, identifying things is so easy, but changing them is obviously the challenge. And so then what do we do with that information? What would my exercises be for that guy? And can I have confidence that when he comes back to see me in 3 to 4 weeks time, that he will no longer have that? And that is, I think I'm getting there in terms of exercise selection, but it is one of the most resistant things to change. Again, might be reflective of the fact that I'm still figuring out my exercises around it. But it's a really interesting concept. But I am utterly convinced that it is gold for hamstring, for unpicking the challenging hamstring.
Moving a little bit away from like NordBord and specific direct hamstring loading assessments and or just training. You mentioned before in some of like the assessments that you will do, a battery of jumps. It's always an interesting area that I have kind of like wanted to learn more about. You'll hear people like Matt Jordan talk about how they'll do the squat jump test, and sometimes post ACL you'll have that hamstring coactivity that will kind of delay or prevent some knee extension velocity within a jump. So maybe late stage impulse is low or certain things like that. Have you found anything that you find to be like interesting, relevant when it comes to assessing jump or plyometric capacity in hamstring injuries?
Yeah, so generally what I will tend to find is it's the drop jump is where I catch them all out. I generally find it's a context time will be the one that I expect to do it. So I suppose my process is again, I'm really conscious of I need to get as much relevant information as I can out without turning this into a testing session. And so I try to keep to here's my basic assessment, my level 1 assessment, and I add on top of that. So for me, we'll work through CMJ, and generally for me, look, I would say most guys that I see probably tend to have quite a good CMJ, particularly relative to their knee iso push. I think most people I see tend to be on the higher end in terms of power, potentially could push on towards a higher level on the iso push. I certainly see more 50 plus centimeter CMJs than I do 4 plus knee iso pushes. Then we work through single leg CMJs. My expectation is that they should be about half of their double leg CMJ. That's what I tend to see. So 50 centimeter return to a 25. To definitely probably see less counter movement depth on the injured side, even in hamstring injuries. I know that's something that guys talk about a little bit around obviously the knee injury rehabilitation, but I see it all the time. That's just, even if, frequently I don't see that they struggle to hit the height, but they'll struggle to hit the depth, and they'll kind of comment about, they'll be almost surprised that they've hit the height because they'll feel awkward doing it. So again, we'll try to train that ability to triple flex and to lower themselves down quickly and slowly. Drop jump would probably be the one that I tend to find. Again, I just probably don't see guys that are as reactive relative to the power that they're producing. So, I don't see that many low 0.2 contact times, to be honest, anymore. Whether that's the kind of some of the athletes that I'm working with, but even on the really quick, 10 plus meters per second guys, I tend to probably the one that most people, when we come to the drop jump, I end up finding myself having a conversation around, actually, do you know what? And I'm not even saying this is necessarily on the injured side. I'm saying most of the time I say to those guys, actually, I think that we can, I think this is an obvious area where you're below where you are. It's like some of that Williams stuff where it's like, their isometric strength relative to their eccentric strength around the hamstring, and some kind of almost like eccentric utilization ratio around the hamstring. I would find that most of the ones I see, the concept I would see would be, this is a powerful guy who could be stronger and potentially could be more reactive. But again, it's an interesting concept. And I think most people who come to me end up, we spend some time training reactivity, both vertically and horizontally.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It's definitely an area where you can. I feel like just drop jumps as a whole, regardless of the injury status. There's some athletes that you see, whether it's on the field or court, and you're just like, wow, this person just looks incredibly reactive, and then you have them do it in a controlled environment, and it does not look the exact same, or it doesn't look similar. And so it's such a, in my opinion, like a black box area of trying to understand, reactive strength assessments a little bit better too. But no, I love it. Fearghal, real quick, I don't want to keep you too long, but just want to kind of fire off a couple short answer questions. When people ask you, what are people missing most often in a hamstring rehab? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
The idea of the hamstring as a victim of things that are going on elsewhere. So that idea of, have you done a truly holistic approach to it? Have you spent time on their injury history? I met a friend of mine before I set up this clinic, and I was trying to figure out what exactly an appointment would look like for me. And he chatted me through his approach to the assessment. And I suppose what probably surprised me was how little time there is to go through injury history. And I think the answer ultimately is in the injury history frequently. And, be that the hip, the knee, the back, the ankle, there will be something in there that I think is worth 20% to you. And so, yeah, I think that is, if a direct approach around the hamstring hasn't worked, it will frequently come down to what is actually causing me to require more of that hamstring.
Now, this one may be a little bit more of an in-depth answer, and that's totally okay. But there's a lot more conversations these days around intramuscular tendon injury, around aponeurosis injury, around T-junctions. What is it about these types of like non-contractile structures that is such a injury, or such a difficult injury to manage? And what is it that you've noticed that we can do about it?
Yeah. So I guess for intramuscular tendon injuries themselves, I suppose what separates that is they probably require a little bit longer to heal. It's a form of tendon tissue that remodels slower than the adjacent myofascial or muscular tendinous junction. So we can say at a physiological level, these take longer to heal. And if we accept that, then we can start planning rehab accordingly. Now, amazing research from Noel Pollock and the guys in British Athletics. And I think they identified that for their guys, they had an unbelievable record on their connective tissue injuries, probably was it 8% or 12%, 1 in 8 or 1 in 12 were re-injuring off their kind of typical hamstring injuries. But of their C-type injuries, about 60% were re-injuring within the first 3 months, which is huge. So more likely than not. So they identify they have effectively straightforward injuries and not straightforward injuries. So they come up with an approach for that where they didn't take longer than they had previously, but they changed how they did it. So Pollock's group changed what they did within the time. So delayed their kind of heavy hinge work, respected the healing. And actually, without taking longer than they used to, they dropped that 60% recovery rate to 0% over the subsequent 4 years. So it's not how long we take, but it's what we do with the time. But there is a critical mass of time I think we need to get out of with these C-type injuries. If we can get to 5-6 weeks alive, then I think we have a right chance, while ultimately optimizing the healing environment within that period. Around the T-junctions, yeah, so how long have you got? So T-junction injuries, look, there's lots of things about these that make them complicated. There's two muscles coming together. In fact, biceps is coming apart from semi-tenproxine and joining together with short hip distally. There's a lot going on. They've got two different nerve supplies. They have two different functions where long head is a hip extensor and knee flexor, where short head is a knee flexor alone. And that's not taking into account even the tibial rotation, hip rotation components that they both add respectively too. And I think the key points around these are slower to heal. I think that's also true. I think other challenges on the T-junction, diagnostically, they don't fit within the BAMIC. So it's not that aponeurosis is not cleanly described. It's not a clean link with our kind of typical C-type injury. So we're not as clear cut as to which are the higher grade ones and which are the ones that we can push back a little bit quicker. The Caris Pedrick's done, published on this recently, and it probably helps us to understand a little bit more. And myself and Kevin Cronin are working on some projects around some of the ultrasound work that hopefully can add some more value there too on the diagnostic side. The last piece really is, on those, Jordan Mendegucci out of Spain has worked on some amazing stuff, which is published in the last couple of months, and better helped us understand that relationship between short head and long head. And really it just seems like short head is there to help out long head. So again, that comes to me, well, actually, if we can understand that intermuscular coordination between those two muscles, so actually how long and short complement each other, and would that mean doing more work for short head or more work for long head? I think to me remains up for debate, but I think considering coordination between muscles, it seems to be a critical component in the T-junction. So I think really with all these types of injuries, there is a critical mass of time where they do just take longer, but it's what we do within that 3, 5, 7, 12, 16 week period that we ultimately decide to take based on the severity that this defines our success or failure to.
Fearghal, this is amazing. I feel like you've hit on so many key points for practitioners along the continuum of testing, training, and some of the anatomy as well. So I think this will be a must listen for pretty much anybody in the rehab space. But Fearghal, if people want to reach out or get in contact with you or learn more about the things that you're doing, what's the best place for them to do so?
Yeah, so my LinkedIn obviously is probably the easiest one to receive messages on. That's just my name, if you can learn how to spell it. And then my Instagram is my kind of main company page, which is Kerin Performance, Kerin, Kerin, and then Performance. And yes, I share most of my things online and from the courses that I'm running and the projects that I'm working on. It all tends to go straight through there. The website's kerinperformance.com as well. So yeah, more than happy to have a chat with anybody that's that wants. It's a topic that I'm fairly interested in, obviously, so happy to continue.
Amazing. Fearghal, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure, Jalen. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course.